Alrighty. Well, thank you everybody for your patience. A little bit of a late start, but we're going to still have some fun with this. And so you're all here to see, Ready, Set, Data, perfecting the art of talent matching with AI. And so let's talk a little bit about the agenda, what we're going to cover, and we'll do some introductions and we'll get started. Cool. So first we'll introduce these two gentlemen over here as well as myself. We'll talk about the journey that JobTarget and Rackspace embarked upon together. We'll talk about the partnership, what we think that means, what we think was successful, maybe some opportunities to do things differently or better in the future. We'll talk about what it takes to be a data-driven organization. And we'll have some fun. We'll look a little bit ahead. We'll think about what generative AI might mean for, I'll say, JobTarget, Rackspace, the market, the industry. And then we'll close it out with really exciting information about FAIR, which is a really neat Rackspace offering, as well as some booth information, which we'd love to have you all visit us. And so let's do some introductions. So first, what we'll do is we'll just do brief introductions, and then when each of these gentlemen has their speaking parts, they'll go into much more detail on their backgrounds and all that great stuff. So first we have Mark Oretta here, CTO of JobTarget. You have myself, CTO of Public Cloud at Rackspace, and then we have Vic here, Senior Director of our Data Analytics and ML practice at Rackspace. So looking forward to spending some time with these gentlemen. And Mark, why don't you go ahead and kick things off for us?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Mark Oretta, and brief history about me. I spent a decade at a media company called iHeartMedia. They have a kind of small festival around here if you've ever been. Then I did a couple startups. One went public, and one did not go public. And then now I've spent the last 4 years at a company called JobTarget. And JobTarget is a company that you probably have never heard of, but have very likely interacted with. We are a recruiting advertising platform for employers to help them manage their job advertising, their job descriptions, find job seekers, and then shepherd the job seekers through the hiring process. Our most popular product is our programmatic advertising product, which uses millions of signals to manage these advertising campaigns in order to optimize the ad spend to make sure that our employers are getting the best candidates they can for the most economical price that they can. So we are an integrator. We connect sites like Indeed, LinkedIn, and ZipRecruiter to applicant tracking systems. So I'm sure if you've ever looked for a job, let's say you wanted to find a job at a company like AWS, they would post their job on aws.com/software developer, and they would post their job. And then they would use a company like JobTarget to then distribute that job across the internet. And then if you decided that that job was the job for you, you would apply. And when you applied, it would come into our system. We would process your job application. We would enrich it if that's what the customer wanted. And then we would send it over to the employer for them to hopefully hire you since you were so excited about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Vic, can you introduce yourself and also tell us a little bit about Rackspace, please?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. My name is Vikram. I head the delivery for Americas and AWS globally for anything related to data analytics and machine learning services. We are a global company, and anything related to data comes from our organization. When it comes to Rackspace, we are one of the premier partners in AWS ecosystem. Our technical accreditations and the certifications talk about that, or showcase how credible we are in the AWS space. We have over 2,800 AWS accreditations, over 200 plus professional certifications, and then more importantly, we have over 16 AWS competencies. And getting a competency is not an easy thing. You need to deliver, prove yourself, and then more importantly, do it, rinse and repeat it on multiple times. On another hand, we have over 16 service delivery designations as well, and we're planning to add 4 to 6 more next year. And we'll continue to grow from there on as well. From the industry research perspective, ISG named us as leader in 4 different things, and one of that is AI/ML and machine learning services as well.
Thank you, Vic. So, Mark, to kick things off, you've been at JobTarget for a bit. Can you talk to us about how the infrastructure maybe was when you joined or started this journey?
Yeah, without a doubt. So JobTarget's been around for about 20 years. So any company that's been around as long as that has some archaic, possibly, software decisions that were made a very long time ago. And when I joined about 4 years ago, we were completely on-prem. And what we were realizing was that our business was becoming very, very limited by our previous technical decisions that were made long before me. We were running into scaling issues. It took us weeks to get a deploy out. I'm sure if you've been around for a while, you knew what that used to be like. You would have an outage window on the 4th Monday of every month for 3 hours, and you put up the little pretty sign, and then you would do the thing. And then my devs were also always chasing bugs. They were firefighting legacy code, not a fun place to be. So we had a lot of challenges. Our challenges were really centered around the fact that our entire software architecture paradigm was hardware-centric. We didn't want to make large amounts of capital expenditures because it's bad for the business. So if you look here at the diagrams, you can see that there's a big blue bar that powers everything. And within that bar in our world was our monolithic set of apps and our monolithic database. That database did everything for us. It was our reporting database, our operational database, our transactional database, our report processor, our nightly routine runner. And we were running out of ways to continue using it because the way that we managed our system was juggling to avoid resource contention. So we had a job that would run at 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. or 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m. And as the business grew, that job that used to run from 8 to 9 started running from 8 to 9:15, and it started running into the next app. And we realized that we really needed to scale up somehow, and we didn't think it made sense 4 years ago to continue buying hardware and continue scaling up our on-premise. So we decided it was time to make our jump to the cloud. So like many companies that want to make their jump to the public cloud, we engaged with all the public cloud providers. And this is where the AWS team really set themselves apart. They were customer obsessed with us even before we were customers. Even before we signed a single piece of paper or spent a penny. They were with us, were helping us put together a proof of concepts, working through some of the challenges that we didn't know how to operate. And they brought experts to teach some of my developers on what to do. So we did what I think many companies do when you have 2 decades of managing your on-premise servers. We were like, we have these experts, and they're helping us. We can do this, right? We're just going to pick up some servers. We're going to move them, and the magic beans are going to take us into the promised land. And so we tried. And we took an app on the edge of our infrastructure. We moved it. We lit it up very excitedly. And it was a disaster. We had data latency issues. We had concurrency issues. The app was not resilient. It was getting out of sync. It was constantly crashing. We were having trouble getting data up and getting data down. So we realized that we needed help. And we re-engaged the AWS team. And they brought in the partner network. And of course, Rackspace was one of them. And we chose Rackspace because we were optimistic. We were optimistic that this was really the first step of our technical journey and that we were going to continue innovating. This was going to be more than just a lift and shift. We wanted to not only lift and shift, but throw away some of the old paradigms, try to use bleeding edge technology to help change an archaic talent acquisition industry, and in a perfect world, change the world for the better. I mean, how many of you have tried to search for a job and enjoyed it? It's probably not very many. And that's because the entire talent search process really stinks. So after we signed with Rackspace, we started the engagement. And one of the solutions architect pulled me aside at the very beginning and said, Mark, hear me out. Give me 30 seconds before you pass judgment. And he said, Mark, this is your opportunity to think about this not just as a technical rebuild, but as a business change, to build the business and design your technical architecture in the way that you want the business to be and not the way that your business is today. So he was right. We engaged with the business teams, and we discovered something that many software developers dream of. A lot of business rules that we had trouble wrapping our heads around because they didn't make sense weren't really business rules or laws at all. They were workarounds created 8 years ago around a technical decision because our old architecture couldn't do it. So we got the opportunity to throw all that stuff away. So we went back to the beginning, and we rethought our business. We restructured our domains, and we thought of what we believed a logical way to rethink our entire data strategy should be. And that question, him pulling me aside, really changed the entire trajectory of the company. So I'd like to ask you guys, is that normal? Is that how you guys engage with customers?
It's funny you say, you point me, ask a pointed question, but I must say, one of the things that we always encourage our solution architects, especially when they are the frontline customer-facing people, right? which we always encourage is, preach, do with attitude and do with approach. So what that primarily means is, work with customer, empower them on this overall digital journey that they are embarking into. And then if they don't have a buy-in, then, I can tell you, the entire project is not going to be successful. So that's the mantra that we have with all of our solution architects and engineer. Work closely with customer, and then more importantly with the business people. It's not just technical people. You need to work closely with the business people as well, or the business side and the customer side as well.
Awesome. So, Mark, when we went down this path together, can you talk into some more detail? What did Rackspace, what did our teams do together to learn how to fish collectively, we'll say?
Yeah, so like I talked about, we tried to do it on our own, and it didn't go very well. What that told me is we were lacking the skill set and the abilities to do it. I didn't have developers who could develop cloud-first architecture, who knew how to work within the nuances that were different between the on-premise and cloud-based systems. So one of the key things that the Rackspace team engaged on was really teaching my developers the why behind some of the decision making. Why are we thinking about data atomically? Why are we not thinking about things in a process-based way? Why are we thinking about APIs and real-time streaming? And why are we not just building it the way we always have, which is have it sit in an API, stick it in a queue, and it happens when it happens? And that took a lot of time. I mean, my developers are very, very smart, and they might think they know everything, and so they're very, very stubborn. So the first time, they had to watch someone build it, and they were, skeptical, because that's who they are. And the Rackspace team showed them the better way. And then the second time, they sat in the room with the team, and they really hand-held their way through building the next set of projects. And what we did is then we created force multipliers out of that. We took the teams and we taught the people, we taught one team, and that team taught another team, and that team taught another team, and just like the candles light an inferno, right? Like everyone lights the next person, the next thing you know, everyone's on fire. And that's really what happened here. And we're still paying, this approach is still paying dividends. The entire team is now able to build cloud-centric apps. The entire team understands why the queues are there, why do we have dead letter queues, why do those queues matter, and they understand how to navigate the nuance there.
Awesome. Oh, thanks, Mark. So, Vic, I think, getting into maybe more detail, can you walk us through the architecture, the concepts, and kind of just how this all came to be?
Yeah. So I still remember, when we first walked into JobTarget, like Mark said, they had one central environment where it had databases running, applications running. It was running more like, request response architecture. And especially when you are in this more scalable industry, and I'm assuming, and I'm sure, JobTarget has scaled a lot in last 2 or 3 years. Or in fact, double, tripled, or over 100, 10,000 times, to be honest. One of the primary thing in order for any organization to be successful when they are scaling up is adapting modern technologies. Like Mark said, when the developers started building their application, by default, every developer will go through a request response architecture. It's good, it works, but when it comes to scaling, it fails. And a good example is take Amazon.com. Imagine if they are on a request response architecture and there's a Black Friday deal going on or a Prime Day going on. When you make a request, you can't wait for a response for the next transaction to happen. That's exactly the same thing that we have taken to JobTarget and then started preaching them the importance of event-driven architecture, and especially when you are scaling the organization, and then more importantly, when the organization is moving towards a data-driven organization. And that's one thing that I always say my customers, if your end goal is to become a data-driven organization, start adapting event-driven architecture. And when we started designing the event-driven architecture for JobTarget, and the first thing that we did is tell them what is event-driven architecture, how it is important, how it can scale, and then more importantly, how you can grow with that architecture as well.
Yeah. So what you're looking at here is our new architecture. So a few slides back, I think I showed you the architecture where you had the big blue box in the middle that powered everything. And what you see on the left is the high-level diagram, and what you see on the right is a more tactical, actual service-based diagram. But the key difference when you look at this is all of the arrows going in a lot of different directions. And this is critical to what we're able to do now in the future. So instead of everything going into the main database, when someone clicks an app or applies to a job, that goes into that main database, and it waits to be processed an hour later or 4 hours later or 8 hours later. that app is going to get sent into DynamoDB immediately. Then it's going to get picked up by a Dynamo stream, get sent into EventBridge. It's going to get emitted into many, many Lambdas, where a programmatic app can process it and put it into the campaign in near real time, real time enough for our customers. And then once that gets into the programmatic app and the customers can use it and understand that they're getting value, or if they're really excited about this amazing person that applied to their software developer role, we then take that information and then send it via Glue into our data lake in S3 so that we can continue to use that in our other applications. This new design required like a fundamental shift in how we thought about our apps, we structured our teams, and how the entire tech org was really fundamentally organized. So before, when everything was routed around the blue bar, we all, made calls against the tables directly. And now, if you see many gray boxes, those many gray boxes represent different teams. So when we go back to the business transformation, that's the business transformation. We went from a team of developers all working against the one thing to smaller teams of developers working around more smaller, concrete things, interacting with each other using code contracts, doing it in real time, and then having the benefit of infinite scalability using the Lambdas.
If I may ask one thing, Mark, can you talk about your growth, the amount of growth that you had in the last 3 years, and why this thing has helped you in scaling that much growth?
Yeah, ironically, the next slide talks about that.
Perfect. All right.
So I'm a technologist at heart. I love talking about that stuff, but none of it really matters if you don't change the business. So this new design increased our capacity by 11,000%. Not only did we increase our capacity by 11,000%, we increased revenue by 800%. We did that while paying off technical debt. We did that while retiring old databases. And we were able to grow and hire new people and new teams because we had segmented developer teams. So instead of me hiring 40 developers and having to integrate them into this big mass of humanity and having them understand all of our legacy tech and code, I was able to hire 40 developers and split them into 10 different teams. And those 10 different teams have autonomy and authority in their own individual domains that is able to drive innovation for our company and for our customers. An example of the capacity increase is our programmatic ad builder. So our campaign builder used to take 18 hours to run. It has to manage right around 2.5 million active job postings. And now, last night, it ran in 18 minutes. So that 18 minutes gives us a lot more capacity. When we go back to, well, now what can we do? Well, before we were thinking, what can we cut out? Because what's not adding a ton of value because we can't run it anymore. The conversation is, how much more can we take in, even if it's a nominal amount of value? And when you just keep piling in more and more signals, more and more information, our processes get better, our models get better, our products get better for our customers. And the best part, at least to me, again, technologist at heart, is with all the data being in S3 and it being more or less available for everyone in the company, we've been able to leverage the most modern technologies. We've actually been able to bring a new job description builder to market, leveraging large language models and Gen AI, helping employers to write more readable job descriptions and helping job seekers better understand what's in their job description. I mean, how many of you have read a job description and after you read it 4 times, you still have no idea what the job is. You have no idea if you're qualified for it. You have no idea what your day-to-day looks like. You have no idea if you can even get this job. That is a miss. And I don't know if we can solve that. It's not magic as much as I want it to be magic. But, I mean, it's the step in the right direction.
Yeah. So, Vic, you were a big piece of this. Were there any surprises or ahas that came along here as well?
I think the growth was something that I wasn't expecting, and I'm just being honest. 11,000% growth is remarkable.
Yeah.
But we also need to give credit to the underlying technology that we were able to build for JobTarget, and then more importantly, all this architecture that we have spoken about, event-driven and job matching and all of that, that has laid the foundation for JobTarget to be more data-driven organization. It is important in current market, for organization to be more data-driven. That way, you can make meaningful decisions based on data, and this is the fundamental, ground level thing for it to be successful.
Okay. So, moving on, becoming a data-driven organization is not an easy thing, but it does pave the path for a whole lot of new opportunities. Can you share maybe, what you want to achieve next? What's next for you?
Yeah. So before I go there, I do want to talk a little bit about what the change in the data-driven organization, what has happened in the business. Number one, it's been more fun. So instead of me interacting with dull business people who are asking very basic questions. How are we doing this month and what are we going to do next month? I'm getting intelligent questions. I'm getting questions like, our top publisher, our #1 publisher is losing share shift to our #3 publisher, but only in our top 10% of customers. Do we know why? Do you have a hypothesis as to why that's the case? And those conversations drive immensely bigger outcomes and better outcomes than the conversations before, where everyone's fighting through like normal processes. But looking forward on top of that, we definitely want to keep information security and protect all of the data of all the job seekers who trust us with all of their information. The information is very sensitive to them. It's a resume that contains a lot of information about you. So the information security team has a seat at the table, and we want to make sure that all of our systems are very resilient and hardened against attacks so that we don't lose all of that information. And then it's not perfect. Don't get me wrong. It's faster, it's better, we're making more money, all of that sounds great. But one of the things that this new design has created is it's created 18 new silos. So before, I had a big blue box, and in that blue box, I knew that the data in there was the system of record for our entire world. But now I have 15 teams with 15 purpose-built databases with 15 different cadences in which they manage the data, and maybe they even have 15 different versions of the same term. Like maybe someone calls a job description one thing and someone else puts salary in it, so they call it salary plus job description or something silly like that. So now we're embarking on a journey to use and build a data mesh, thankfully using you guys. Going back to our original premise that you guys were going to help us, not just do the lift and shift, but to continue to help us innovate. And with that data mesh, I'm hoping that we can bring the 15 silos back together and put Humpty Dumpty back on the wall, right? Like the problem was it was big and it wasn't great, but it was working. But now there's 15 and it's faster and bigger. And now you get into weird data taxonomy issues and data concurrency issues and people having like slightly wrong data, which can confuse a customer.
So, and the other thing that I want to say, specific to JobTarget and data mesh is, especially when you're a growing organization, you want data to be available immediately. And if you have a central data warehouse or a central reporting system, and you have to go to a central team to get the data, and then you find meaningful decisions out of it, you're losing time, and who knows, your competitor might have another product built already. So, setting up the data mesh architecture for JobTarget was key for us. And when I say key, this is something that we spoke, probably like 3 months, 6 months ago, to start thinking about the mesh architecture and why it is important, how you can have marketing team doing their own data mining and then still rely on the central architecture to make sure that the governance is in place and make sure they're not misusing the data and everything. Because there are a bunch of ML models that JobTarget run. And if each and every time they come to a central organization, then it becomes a bottleneck. And that's a key thing that we were trying to avoid when we're thinking about a design architecture for a data-driven organization at JobTarget.
Yeah, another point on the data mesh was that now it becomes easier for us to add more pieces of information to our systems. So an example is COVID made remote work more palatable for employers, and then now maybe it's not quite so palatable depending on where you work. But with these changes in the regular world, talent acquisition, recruiting, hiring, onboarding, it struggles to keep up. So we're wanting to use things like, can we better predict if you have a job that is remote friendly, where you can find remote workers? Does that make it actually cheaper for you to hire? Can we actually help the HR person understand the justification of, if you have a head office in New York, but you can have a remote person in Chillicothe, Ohio, is the savings worth the pain and suffering of having remote workers? Maybe, but it's hard for them to quantify that. They use a lot of anecdotal stories. They talk about the pain and suffering of onboarding, but can they talk about how easy it is to recruit, or how easy it is to find more, or how easy is it to continue to grow the organization economically?
Vic, question for you. A typical data mesh journey, what are the stages in building a strategy there?
So when you think about a data mesh strategy, it's not an overnight thing that you can build an entire data mesh architecture. And it's a complex architecture, but more importantly, there are some pitfalls as well that organizations needs to be aware of. If you don't have proper governance and controls, if you don't have proper data cataloging, and data validation and data quality checks and everything, then it's not going to be successful. So we always start with eventually we want organization to be more data-driven. And then we understand what are the individual business needs. What is marketing trying to accomplish? What are their bottlenecks as of today from data perspective? How do they take the internal data, and when I say internal data, like the data that apps are generating, combine that with external factors, and then create a model that would make more sense for the organization than just using the current data set that they have. Keeping all of those things in mind, is how we design a data mesh architecture. Once we define an architecture, then comes building the data pipeline and making sure that it's one pipeline that's serving all the purposes and everything, and getting the data ingested in right time, right fashion, and then more importantly, the cataloging is happening. So if the cataloging is not happening, then marketing resource might not know exactly where to go and get it, and it is. I think that's one area where most of the organizations oversee. They don't do proper cataloging in the mesh architecture, and that's where they fail. So that's another key area to be aware of. And then more importantly, going back to my original comment about if you are in this digital data modernization journey, the moment you think about event-driven, my suggestion is by default you have to think about data mesh. The traditional data browsing is not going to be helpful there.
Mark, anything to add there? So one more question before I move on. So your team's now leveraging the data. They have access to the data. What are some of maybe the comments from the team as part of that? Have they shared any surprises or ahas about that?
Yes, both good and bad. So on the good front, they like how fast data is there, whereas before they had to wait until 8 a.m. the next day to start doing their work to see if anything was actually successful. On the bad side, they're impatient, and now they see some data coming in, but maybe it's clean, and maybe they should use it, and maybe they shouldn't use it. But thankfully, with the business teams and the business partners being more bought in and using some of the more modern analytics tools that we're giving them, the business teams are actually asking these questions to help us manage some of the taxonomy challenges that Vikram was talking about.
Awesome. All right.
I think that's one area that we have seen at JobTarget, or I personally have seen in conversations with Mark and their business team is the data taxonomy issue. Everyone understands that it is there, but no one can confirm, okay, is this the right number? And they always go back to, oh, my Excel says differently. Yeah. You won't believe how many times we had this conversation around Excels, and we still continue to have that conversation. But if you want to be a data-driven organization, then let's start moving away from those Excels.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. So looking ahead with Gen AI, or maybe AI in general, Mark, how is that going to affect the future? Do you think? How do you see that playing out for JobTarget?
Good. So for us, there's the most obvious place, of course, optimizing our programmatic advertising system, which includes taking things like I was talking about earlier, including trying to process additional signals like whether or not you want to hire remote workers. But there are other products that we're hoping to bring to bear that will help shepherd employers in choosing the right job seekers, solving some things like unintended bias and unintended discrimination, and then leverage ways to help screen out things within the resumes. So we don't do any resume construction yet, but we've already noticed that within the resumes that are coming in, there's been a pretty stark change over the last 8 to 10 months. And not surprisingly, it's happened mostly on the technical front, where previously you would see very dry, boring resumes from software developers. Brilliant people, but they don't communicate well. They don't communicate well on topics that they like, and you expect them to then compose their 20-year illustrious career into a 2-page resume. And that 2-page resume doesn't represent how they work, what makes them successful. Should they be in the office 3 days a week or 5 days a week? And I'm not sure we can get there anytime soon. But I think those are the things that get me excited, is maybe we can help try to find a way and think about bringing in additional data sources in order to optimize these tools, in order to help people get the job that is actually a better fit for them rather than the job that falls in their lap. I think a lot of people take the job that is most convenient, that pays them more money than the job they have today. That's a very normal way to make your career progress, but that might not be the most optimal way to do it. And then I think the other thing we can do with all this increased capacity is start bringing in additional signals that we didn't think mattered quite so much. Housing build statistics, for example, could be a leading indicator as to whether or not there are going to be more jobs there. More office emptiness or occupancy rates could also help drive some of these things. And again, with all of the additional capacity, we can start processing all of these things and hopefully optimizing our systems.
Vic, how about you? From a Rackspace perspective, what are you excited about?
So when it comes to AI or generative AI using LLMs, right? From Rackspace perspective, what we have started is, we have created a spin-off called FAIR. It stands for Foundry for AI by Rackspace. What we do as part of that is, it's basically a global incubator where we build solutions both for internal use and for external use. The way I would explain FAIR is, we have 4 layers. One of the first layer is the services layer, as you can see. We have ideate, where we sit down with customers and ideate on a specific use case. And if they don't know what to start with, then we sit down and understand define a use case that make more sense and have a more meaningful impact in the short term and also long term. Once you have that ideate, we take that use case and incubate it. And as incubate is nothing but creating an MVP solution for our customers, pretty much production ready. And then the last one as part of our services is industrialized. That's where we build the application to be more scalable, make sure all the governance and controls are in place, and then more importantly, preach responsible AI. Responsible AI and ethical AI is key these days, than before. The second layer that we have is the capabilities. We are a global organization. We have over 2,000 plus certified skill rackers. Most of our rackers are AI ready in some shape or form. Now that's because we are using for internal and for external as well. And we have defined solution accelerators for our customers. That's one key differentiator that we do. We have either a tier 3 IP or a tier 2 IP that we have built for our and that's a differentiator as part of our FAIR. And then more importantly, our AWS capabilities talks about the competencies that we have and all things included AWS. And the third layer as part of our FAIR incubator program is the FAIR AI framework that we bring to the table. I'll get into the details of what AI framework is and how we approach things and all of that. And as part of the framework, one of the things that we always preach is, like I said, responsible AI. Like anything and everything that we build has to be symbiotic, secure, and more importantly, scalable. If it's not scalable, then what are we building this solution for? And in order for all of these 3 layers to be successful, partner ecosystem is key. We are all in AWS Partner. That's one. We also have partnership with Hugging Face, Able, Anthropic, and then there are more coming in the way as well. So if you go to the AI framework, right? Whenever an organization is thinking about building an AI solution, right? Whether irrespective whether how big or how small it is, you always have to start with a secure cloud platform. Creating a secure landing zone is going to be key. I'll dive a level below on how an AWS-specific secure landing zone looks like, all the things that you have to consider and everything. And once you have the foundation laid out, the supply chain is key. When I say supply chain, it's the data. Like, what's the point in building a solution if you don't have the right data? It'll be garbage in and garbage out. So having a right supply chain, right data sources is going to be key. And once you have the supply chain kind of defined, and then you start incorporating your AI framework. What are those connectors? What are those prompt templates that you have to deploy for your individual business units? And then on the top lies the overall generative AI application that is where more customer-facing and more users use it. That's where we help with fine-tuning to a certain extent, model serving. More importantly, prompt engineering is where more and more we spend time with our customer. So coming to the secure AI platform, right? One of the key things that we go to the secure AI platform is how we deploy our AWS platform, right? When I say responsible AI, like any AWS architecture that we implement, or that architecture that you see there, it implements based on zero trust, least access privileges, and more importantly, like encryption. The data is encrypted from end to end, and then we have Taylor created around 250 plus policies that you have to, by default, account for when you are implementing a secure landing zone for AI. Not many organizations think about it, but it is equally important to make sure that your landing zone is airtight. All guardrails are in place. That way, you can preach responsible AI. Here is a sample application or a sample architecture that you see. You have a generative AI application on the front end where users are interacting with, whether it's a structured data source or an unstructured data source. And now all the data in flight is encrypted. If you look at the foundation model, it's frozen. That's because once you put in a secure landing zone, you're not training that foundation model using the public data. And we do not store any customer data or parameters as part of a foundation model as well. So those are the key things that you have to account for when you're building a scalable AI application.
Great. Anything to add, Mark?
No, this is awesome.
So we have a recorded video that Vic's going to do a live voiceover on, and we're going to see if it plays.
Yeah, so one of the things that I want to showcase here was as part of our FAIR practice or business unit, right? What we have done is, as we work with JobTarget and other customers, what we have built is, we have created a focused application powered by generative AI. The key here is we are helping recruiters and interviewers to streamline the interview process. And the key here is responsible, unbiased way and everything. We are not asking them to make your decisions based on it, but we are helping them or we are guiding them to make sure that you ask the right questions to the interviewer and all of that. So if you look at this demo here, right? We input the type of role that we are hiring for, the company that we are hiring for, and the question categories. The question categories is where it's more customized from organizations to organizations. In this particular example, our core values are different than JobTarget's core values. So that's where we have to do some engineering. And then you input the job description. That way, the questions that we are generating using LLM are more tailored towards that particular job description. So you input those 3 or 4 values, and then we generate an interview questions that the recruiter can use to do the first level of screening before you pass it on to a technical resource. And the key here is we are binary. When I say binary, we are not. None of the interviewers are making a decision based on this, but we are helping them guide what sort of questions to ask. If a resume says that I have worked on event-driven architecture, ask them to explain what an event-driven architecture is. Things like that. It's as simple as that.
So I have 2 comments on that. One is, I think this highlights the evolution of our partnership as it continues to move from migrating to innovating to now they're helping us ideate. The second part is, I remain hopeful with products like these that we are going to keep changing things. I'm assuming everyone in the room is technical. Maybe that's not true. But when you talk to an HR person, who are lovely, they're great human beings, but sometimes they just ask completely the wrong questions, and they have no idea they're asking completely the wrong questions. So you go through this first interview with them, and it doesn't actually move anywhere. And tools like this is why I'm so excited about the whole Gen AI front. It's allowing the democratization of technical skills to people who are not historically technical.
And then, I see it day to day as well, when I'm recruiting resources, right? That data science was a good example. If the recruiter is not technical, he can be a good recruiter, go make good connections with the people and bring the right people to the table. But if he's not doing that first level of screening, then it doesn't help me. So a product like this or a tool like this, will definitely help recruiters do those initial screenings and then put the right candidates in front of the leaders.
All right. So thank you both. So let's go ahead and close this out. So first, I want to make sure that everyone's aware of they can learn more about the 2 offerings from Rackspace that Vic had mentioned. We offer an ideate phase, which kind of helps you understand the art of the possible. And then there's an incubate opportunity. It's a very, very rapid, aggressive pace to take this concept and make it an MVP and ultimately industrialize it. And so if you want to learn more, there's some QR codes. It's a really, really streamlined, aggressive, we think successful motion. And then, the last piece I'll say is, if you want to learn more, if you want to talk to us, if you want to see the image generation that Vic has mentioned, come visit us at our booth. We are at booth number 450. We also have a neat VR experience, which is pretty cool. And we'd love to have you. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to learn more about your business, what's challenging you, and share some things that we see and things that you see. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for your time. And thank you both for your expertise and for your patience with me asking you questions.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.